Hey everyone, welcome back to the latest episode of the Withstand podcast. I'm so glad that you're here reading through the Holy Bible with me, verse by verse, page by page, through the Old Testament and New Testament in parallel. We're currently finishing off the book of Leviticus before we start a new season and a couple of new chapters. And in our last episode, we read through till verse 28. Today we'll pick up in verse 29 and read through to the end of the chapter. And this is God's word. If a man sells a house in a walled city, then he may redeem it within a whole year after it is sold. Within a full year he may redeem it. But if it is not redeemed within the space of a full year, then the house in the walled city shall belong permanently to him who bought it throughout his generations. It shall not be released in the Jubilee. However, the houses of villages which have no wall around them shall be counted as the fields of the country. They may be redeemed, and they shall be released in the Jubilee. Nevertheless, the cities of the Levites and the houses in the cities of their possession, the Levites may redeem at any time. And if a man purchases a house from the Levites, then the house that was sold in the city of his possession shall be released in the Jubilee, for the houses in the cities of the Levites are their possession among the children of Israel. But the field of the common land of their cities may not be sold, for it is their perpetual possession. If one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Take no usury or interest from him, but fear your God, that your brother may live with you. You shall not lend him your money for usury, nor lend him your food at a profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, to give you the land of Canaan, and to be your God. And if one of your brethren who dwells by you becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. And then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possession of his fathers, for they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over them with rigour, but you shall fear your God. And as for your male and female slaves whom you have, from the nations that are around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Moreover, you may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you, and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property. And you may take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as a possession. They shall be your permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another with rigour. Now if a sojourner or stranger close to you becomes rich, and one of your brethren who dwells by him becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner close to you, or to a member of the stranger's family, after he is sold he may be redeemed again. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle's son may redeem him, or anyone who is near of kin to him in his family may redeem him, or if he is able he may redeem himself. Thus he shall reckon with him who bought him. The price of his release shall be according to the number of years, from the year that he was sold to him until the year of Jubilee. It shall be according to the time of a hired servant for him. If there are still many years remaining, according to them he shall repay the price of his redemption from the money with which he was bought. And if there remain but a few years until the year of Jubilee, then he shall reckon with him, and according to his years he shall repay him the price of his redemption. He shall be with him as a yearly hired servant, and he shall not rule with rigour over him in your sight. And if he is not redeemed in those years, then he shall be released in the year of Jubilee, he and his children with him. For the children of Israel are servants to me, they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. This is the word of the Lord. And Tom Constable writes the following. If an Israelite owned a house in a walled city and sold it, he had the right to redeem or repurchase it for 1 year. If he did not redeem it within that year, he could not redeem it. It remained the property of the person who purchased it as long as he wanted to own it. If an Israelite owned if an Israelite owned a house in an unwalled village, the house was to be considered the same as land and was subject to 3 conditions for redemption mentioned above. Property given by God to the Levites fell under special laws. Houses in these cities that had been bought by non-Levites could be redeemed by the Levites at any time. If they were not redeemed before the year of the Jubilee, they would automatically revert to Levite ownership in the year of Jubilee. The Levites were prohibited from selling the pasture fields that surrounded these cities to non-Levites. God gave these cities and their pastures to the Levites as permanent possessions. The relationship of land and people under God is of fundamental importance for understanding the Old Testament and the Jewish people. The promised land was a gift from God, not an inalienable right of anyone's to sell or incorporate as they wished. Rules for loaning to poor Israelites. The Israelites were not to take advantage of one another in view of these year of Jubilee regulations. Specifically, if one of their countrymen became poor, his neighbours were to sustain him, whether he was a stranger or a resident, so that he could continue to live among them. Nor were the Israelites to charge their fellow Israelites any kind of interest. This policy would have helped a poor farmer buy enough seed for the next year. This law was evidently unique among the ancient Near Eastern nations, though not among smaller tribal groups. Annual interest rates in Mesopotamia often fell in the range of 20 to 33%. Nor were the Israelites to sell their poor neighbour anything to make a profit for themselves. They were to remember how Yahweh had freely brought them out of Egypt and given them the land of Canaan so that they could make these sacrifices graciously. The acceptance of God's sovereignty over his people and all their possessions leads to the magnanimous and compassionate treatment of the poor and the destitute, because at the end of the age everyone will be released from bondage. The legislation regarding the year of Jubilee has been used to campaign for the cancellation of debts owed to rich countries by poor third world countries. In biblical terms, the Jubilee principle means that it is unjust for people of the same stock to enslave or impoverish one another permanently. Rules involving slaves. When poor Israelites sold themselves as servants to wealthier Israelites, their masters were to treat them as foreign hired workers and not as slaves. The original law in the Book of the Covenant had to do with the Hebrew in the social, not ethnic sense, that is, with the landless man who survived by selling his services to an Israelite household. By contrast, in Leviticus 25, it deals with the man who is an Israelite landholder, but who has been forced by poverty to mortgage it, and then to sell his family and himself into the service of a fellow Israelite. The year of Jubilee would liberate these Israelite hired workers and their sons who presumably worked with their fathers so that they could return to their families and their original property. The rationale behind this law was that the Israelites belonged primarily to Yahweh, who had redeemed them. Therefore, their fellow Israelites were not to sell them as slaves or rule over them with severity. Obedience would show reverence or fear of Yahweh. God permitted the Israelites to acquire slaves from the pagan nations around them and from among the foreign residents who lived in Israel and their descendants. They could even pass them on to their sons as an inheritance. That they were not to mistreat them goes without saying, and they were not to treat their fellow Israelite slaves harshly. The Jubilee release does not apply to foreign slaves. A theological reason underlies this discrimination. God redeemed his people from Egyptian slavery to become his slaves. It is unfitting, therefore, that an Israelite should be resold into slavery, especially to a foreigner. The Jubilee law is thus a guarantee that no Israelite will be reduced to that status again, and it is a celebration of the great redemption when God brought Israel out of Egypt so that he might be their God and they should be his people. Slavery was widespread in the ancient Near East, including Israel. Slavery in itself, as a Mosaic law regulated it, did not violate basic human rights, but the abuse of slaves did. During the Civil War era, some Americans used passages like these to prove that it was biblical and right for people to own and sell slaves. But it must be noted that God's laws didn't establish slavery, they regulated it and actually made it more humane. Slavery was an institution that had existed for centuries before Moses gave the law, and the law of Moses forbade the Jews to enslave one another. If the early church had launched a militant crusade against slavery, it would have identified Christianity as a political movement, and this would have hindered the spreading of the gospel in the Roman world. Since there were no democracies or popular elections in those days, the church had no vehicle for overthrowing slavery. When you consider how difficult it's been for the contemporary civil rights movement even to influence the Christian church, how much more difficult it would have been to wage such a war in the days of Caesar. In the first place, for one people or person to enslave another is, by that very act, to claim the other as one's own. It is in a fundamental sense to claim another's life as belonging to oneself. Such a claim, however, flies in the face of the biblical story that we have heard thus far. If the creation narratives of Genesis tell us anything, they tell us that the sovereign source and the Lord of life is God, and God alone. It is in just that sense that to God and God alone, all life, the work of his hands, ultimately rightly belongs. Therefore, from the standpoint of these biblical narratives, anyone besides God laying such ultimate claims to another's life would in fact be arrogating to oneself another's prerogatives. In essence, such a one would be making the most presumptuous claim any human being could make, the claim to be God. Rules involving Israelites held by foreigners and strangers. Israelites could also buy back or redeem their countrymen who had sold themselves as slaves to non-Israelites who were living in the land. An Israelite who, because of his poverty, had sold himself to a non-Israelite in the land could be redeemed from his condition. Either a relative of his could redeem him, or he could redeem himself if he had sufficient funds to do so. In such cases, the Israelites were to calculate the cost of redemption in view of the coming year of Jubilee, when all slaves in the land went free anyway. If the Israelite slave could not redeem himself and did not have a relative who could, he was to be set free in the year of Jubilee. Strangers living in Israel were subject to the law of Israel. So even though a foreigner living in Israel might claim that he did not have to set his slave free in the year of Jubilee, he was under obligation to do so for two reasons. He had to abide by the laws of the land, and the Israelites were Yahweh's servants whom he had redeemed from the land of Egypt. The year of Jubilee is not mentioned in the Old Testament outside the Pentateuch. There is no direct biblical evidence regarding its observance in Israel's history, but if its practice was normal, there might have been no occasion to mention it. On the other hand, the apparent failure of Israelites to keep the sabbatical years during the monarchical period suggests that the Jubilee might also have been violated. In summary, there were 7 set seasons, excluding the weekly Sabbath, that the Israelites were commanded to observe. The Feast of Passover or Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Pentecost, also known as Harvest, Weeks and First Fruits, the Blowing of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Tabernacles, the Sabbatical Year, and the Jubilee Year. The Hebrew word for 7 comes from a root word that means to be full, to be satisfied. It's also related to the word meaning to swear, to make an oath. Whenever the Lord sevens something, he's reminding his people that what he says and does is complete and dependable. Nothing can be added to it. And I'll leave a link to these wonderful notes in the show notes for you guys. Gosh, it's super interesting to learn a little bit more about slavery, and certainly that slavery existed before the Mosaic Covenant, and that God provided regulations and I guess what you would call in today's day and age best practice in terms of the way slaves were to be treated, and also when you can buy slaves versus when you cannot buy slaves. And I had no idea that Israelites were permitted to buy slaves from the pagan communities, and that's interesting in and of itself. But I don't know about you, but when I think of the word slavery, certainly in years gone by, I think of human beings owning and then abusing the rights of other human beings. And certainly when we think about the terms modern slavery, and we understand that to mean all sorts of human rights abuse across the globe and across the board, and it's, look, the horrific part about it is that it's happening in plain sight in some instances. I often wonder about some of these salons and the people who are trafficked there to serve us for, the frivolous things like massages and nail salons and all sorts of things. And of course, I have no evidence to support this, but my understanding is from the very little that I've read into it that these things are going on all the time. And it's just interesting to learn a little bit more about slavery, and that no slaves were to be abused, whether they were Israelite slaves or they were from outside of that community, which is absolutely not on. And of course, why would it be? That was under God's jurisdiction. So super interesting to learn a little bit more about that. And yeah, just, I don't know, educate myself a little bit more, because you often hear people argue against the Bible and that God was an evil God because he allowed slavery and death and wars and destruction and sickness in children and all these sorts of things. And slavery is often one of the big arguments that people have. And now I know a little bit more, and I can provide a little bit more context and point to some key Bible verses as well for people to, I guess, educate themselves as well as myself. So today's daily devotion is kind of related in a way, and I guess that's because I've often listened to the wrong people when it comes to my understanding of slavery, particularly in biblical times. So today's daily devotion is titled Stop and Listen, and I would argue stop and listen to the right person, and of course that is God, and listen to him as he speaks through the pages of his Holy Bible. So this is from Dr. Charles Stanley, and it's based on Isaiah chapter 55 verse 3. Incline your ear and come to me, listen that you may live. And Dr. Stanley writes, you may be a person who prays a great deal. Perhaps you have a list of people you intercede for. Likewise, you share your heart with the Father, letting him know everything that's bothering you. Yet something is still missing from your relationship with him. You don't feel close to him, sense his wisdom guiding your steps, or feel his resurrection power fueling your obedience to him. Why? The answer is simple. We all have friends who talk so much that we can never get a word in. Amen to that. Even when they ask us questions, they barely pause before they're off on another train of thought. Sadly, that's how most of us are with God. We talk and don't stop to listen. Oh, we may ask him about his will or to give us wisdom, but we usually don't give him much time to respond before we're giving him our opinion of what he should do. But if you really want to know someone, you have to listen, and that goes double for God. God's every word has meaning and impact. He does not speak merely to be heard. He speaks the very words of life that will absolutely transform you from the inside out. So stop and hear what he has to say. And he prays, Jesus, I come before you to listen. Speak, Lord, and I will obey. Amen. Man, I'm absolutely guilty of that. Like Charles Stanley says here, I've got a list of people who I pray for. I've got so many things that I give thanks and praise for as well, and I try to think of nice long lists of all my blessings, but again, I'm just talking at God. Doesn't help that I live alone with a Labrador, so I don't get many opportunities to talk throughout the day, but it's funny. It's so true. I just talk and talk and talk, and clearly I'm doing the same thing here as I talk and talk at you as well. So I'll wrap it up here, and I thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. I pray that it was a blessing for you, and I pray that it just provides you with a little bit of a reprieve from the madness that's out there at the moment. We all know what we're referring to there. There's so much to take in, let's just say that, and lots of deception to decipher. So that's another thing on my list. I pray for discernment as well, but I need to listen more, that's for sure. Until next time, guys, I pray for each and every one of you. Take care. God bless. Maranatha.